Well, okay. So basically, I wanted to discuss what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now. We're sort of in this uneasy ceasefire truce that seems to be changing every couple of hours. And the last flare of violence was dubbed the first AI war, not just by the press, but also by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So I'm really glad to have you all here who know different things than I do. And I'll just introduce you. Dr. Amelia Buttress, you're a research scientist in public health. You have a really eclectic background that includes media studies, and you're joining us from the US, but you actually have personal ties to the Levant region. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again, Dr. Moore, for having me. And I'm so looking forward to meeting the rest of the guests. My grandfather's family is from just outside of Beirut in Lebanon. And I was really lucky enough to get to visit there quite a few years ago now. It was about a decade ago. So I'll draw from that, but certainly having had the experience to be in the area, as well as to think about the comparisons from the United States, offers a lot of rich contrast and comparisons.
Okay. And Mr. Atieh Al-Matti, you have an academic background in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, but you work in tech and specifically with data and marketing. So you are also joining us from the US, but I believe you also have some ties to the region. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So my family is Palestinian. Well, my dad's family is Palestinian, and I have family living in Palestine in the West Bank currently. I lived in the region myself about 14 years in the Middle East, primarily in Jordan, but in other areas as well. So I have deep ties to the region as well.
Okay. And I had hoped that Mr. Netanel Barak would join us. I guess something has happened, but he certainly has deep ties to the region. He studied Hebrew, ancient and modern, but he's also a member of the Israeli army, and he has lived in Israel, obviously. And Dr. Finkelstein, you really almost don't need an introduction. You're an activist and academic. You've published, I believe, over a dozen books. And you also have an upcoming book on the phenomenon of canceling. And you also have ties to the region, I would say, but I'm not sure you're actually allowed to even enter Israel. Are you allowed in?
No, let me just make some corrections. I would say I have 7 genuinely discrete books. Sometimes books overlap, and so I'd like to exclude them. So I would say it's fair to say I have 7 discrete books. I have no ties to the region. I spent some time there during the years 1988 through 95, but never for a sustained period. And I was then officially denied entry. I think it was 2006. I'm not certain, for 10 years, but I knew it would be renewed for life. So I never bothered trying again to enter.
Oh, wow. Wow, that is pretty terrible in a way. I don't want to start out talking about the heaviest of heaviest things, like what's gone on with the real violence. I figured I'd start out with something else, and that is that we're seeing all of this activity on social media. I just put this tweet up from Atieh Al-Matti. He's an Egyptian data scientist, and he wrote, "We might be witnessing the first human protest against AI algorithms." And he was talking about this phenomenon of Palestinians using different kinds of Arabic. And actually, I would say it's gotten even more interesting than that, because if you follow sort of data science and what's going on, there are a few companies and organizations that have actually started to use algorithms to encode Arabic, and all sorts of algorithmic tricks to sort of get around the surveillance and other problems with social media, so that Palestinians can still communicate online. So I wanted to ask, first of all, do you, in your personal experience, think there's a phenomenon going on of Palestinians being canceled or censored online? And second of all, does the online world really matter anyways? I mean, how seriously should we take this issue of Twitter and tweets and Instagram and this stuff about Palestine? So Dr. Buttress, I know you have a very strong background in media and public health. Would you comment?
Well, sure. I mean, starting with the last question, I mean, absolutely, I feel like the online world matters. And in part, it has to do with the capacity for people to reach each other real time. I have been speaking, in the United States to a lot of different groups that are organizing, issues from Black Lives Matter, to issues around environmental calamities with pipelines. And, one of the biggest challenges that organizers face is the ability to connect with each other and know what's happening in other places and learn real time. So certainly I think it's incredibly important. In terms of the cancel stuff, I think we see, and certainly the other panelists will have much to add to this, but I think we've seen here, following, the banning of President Trump from Twitter and Facebook, that at the same time that those sorts of political actions are happening with a public face, nobody wants to talk about, WikiLeaks or Julian Assange. And I think the public, we face this sort of crisis where people are quite aware of how much we don't know. And, we really are lacking the ability to, to learn about these things. So I think we have to be very concerned about the relationships between, states and corporations who are making these decisions, oftentimes without, any sort of clarity around how it's happening.
Okay. So, Mr. Atieh Al-Matti, do you feel like Palestinians are sort of being censored or banned online in some way?
Yeah, definitely. Especially when things are going on, when there's a lot of media attention and during this last bombing campaign that was going on, I know a lot of people. I was personally banned twice just during the during 2 weeks. I was banned twice just for posts that had, I wasn't inciting violence. I wasn't saying anything hateful. And once I was starting to gain traction in certain topics or certain issues, I noticed that there's shadow banning that was happening to me and to other activists as well. And, direct bans where I couldn't even be online for 24 to, 72 hours. So I think it's a real problem. And I think it's a combination of algorithmic, banning and actual people being banned, working on that at Facebook or at these social media companies, because you can kind of tell the difference when it's algorithmic. It's like automatic usually, a lot of times. And then sometimes you can dispute it and sometimes you can't. So there's really no transparency in terms of what's happening on the backside, but you can definitely tell that there's a difference between how things work. It's just hard to understand what's going on exactly on the side of these companies.
Right. Yeah. Well, I can say from the Israeli state side, they have somehow decided this stuff is so important. They need to set up centers of people sort of working on social media. And I don't think people on really understand, like they can have people build apps so that literally thousands of Israelis can complain about a post. And what's odd is sometimes they're going to be complaining about some post in Arabic, and I'm asking myself, do these people even read Arabic? Like, I mean, or is this just some kind of, you know, ganging up on activists? On the other hand, you know, do you think it? How much do you think it matters, Mr. Al-Matti, at the end of the day?
I think it matters a lot. I mean, I think public perception and public knowledge of what's going on is very important. And when people are being banned, you're not able to get the right message out. And the only message that a lot of people are going to see is the message that Israel wants them to see. And I think this big, you know, shift in public perception that's starting to happen over the last, you know, couple of years, especially this year, a lot of it is driven by social media. So I think it's very important that we're able to get our message out there without being banned and without being censored. Other than what you mentioned, I also recently read that Israel itself, you know, the state itself has a connection inside with these companies, so that if there's a post that they want to ban, this person from, you know, the state of Israel will contact the company, and the company will ban it like automatically. And they've had meetings with these companies about that. So that's a big issue as well.
Yeah, Ayelet has bragged that basically Facebook will do 95% of what Israel tells it. I don't know how much that hit the English press, but I also don't know how much of it is reality and blustering versus blustering nonsense from Ayelet Sheket, who's a local politician here. So, Dr. Finkelstein, you have seen this conflict probably for the longest, I'm pretty sure. Does all of this algorithmic social media stuff really matter in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I don't know much about the web. I'm kind of old-fashioned. I still read books and I don't read tweets. So that puts me in the minority of probably 1/10 of 1% in the world today. So I'm not the best person to consult on these matters. However, I can make some general comments. First of all, before going to the broader picture, speaking for myself, I do have a webmaster, Sana Qasim from Greece. She's Palestinian in origin. She's a chemist or chemistry teacher by profession, and she is active in the social media, and she posts whatever I post on my own website. On Facebook, which I don't know what it is. I've never accessed Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of those things. But periodically I do get canceled, like the former guest mentioned. And then I have to decide whether to stand my ground and refuse to, as it were, issue an apology, or whether to say, okay, forget it, I'm not going to protest it, just let's move on. Most of the time I choose the second route of not standing on principle, because it doesn't seem to me that the web has any principle. It's just a kind of loony invention, but which has a lot of valuable aspects to it, for sure, many valuable aspects to it. So I've been canceled, as I said, I don't know how many times. I would say once every few months, I get a message that I've been knocked off the web. Also, to the point of companies having a special connection with Israel, that shouldn't surprise. First of all, Israelis are very active in the tech industry. They have their own equivalent of Silicon Valley. And secondly, most of the leadership of, say, Facebook is Jewish, and that connection counts, and it's silly to pretend that it doesn't count. Whether it's Sheryl Sandberg or who's the head of Facebook? His name just slips my mind. Mark Zuckerberg. Their pedigree, their, as it were, genetic pedigree, it does count. I do have a certain amount of annoyance that if you Google my name, on the very first page that comes up, if you were to do it right now, you're going to see this article in a college newspaper, an article in a college newspaper, the headline of which reads, Norman Finkelstein, GS 87, meaning graduate student class of 87, at Princeton, he delivered an anti-Semitic speech. Well, first of all, the claim on the headline is a lie, as the editor of the newspaper eventually conceded. But secondly, it's the oddity. The oddity is, if you Google my name, you'll get about 1.5 million websites. Why of 1.5 million websites would Norman Finkelstein, GS, graduate student, class of 87, delivers anti-Semitic speech? Why would an article in a college newspaper come up on the first page? It's not like many people in the world are interested in the Prince, that's the school newspaper, the Princetonian. It's obvious, an inside connection. Let's smear him on the first page, call him an anti-Semite, have the Princeton imprimatur, you know. So that's all in the real world, where we don't really know much about algorithms, but we know quite a lot about inside connections. It's clear that they have a connection. As to the broader problem, sure, it's a very big problem. Right now, the Jewish organizations spearheaded by the State of Israel are trying to get everybody, colleges, states, United States, states, Congress, to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism. It's called the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism definition has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, nothing whatsoever. It's just a criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. That's the definition. And they're trying now to get all the social media to adopt that definition. They're trying to get Facebook to adopt that definition, to get Twitter to adopt that definition, and thereby any criticism of Israel, literally, if you say Israel is a racist state, by that definition, you're an anti-Semite. If the Twitter and Facebook adopt the definition, you can't even post. Now, this is literally the case. You can't even post the most recent report of Human Rights Watch, which said that Israel is a state based on Jewish domination. Well, if it's based on Jewish domination, that makes it a racist state. And that will be banned. So you will pretty much, if that definition gets adopted, and there's a huge amount of pressure now, just as there's a huge amount of pressure on states in the United States. I think a couple of days ago, Texas adopted the definition. They're going state by state, legislature by legislature, governor by governor. If it gets adopted, then all criticism of Israel will be prohibited on the social media. And that's obviously a problem, and one that people should, I think, people should take seriously. I want to just make one last comment pertaining to the last remark. What is the young man's name? Atieh?
Yeah.
Atieh. I happen not to agree that speech which incites violence or incites hate, I don't think that speech should be banned. I don't know if you're a resident of the United States, but that's certainly not the protocols in the US. The Communist Party of the United States calls for the overthrow of the US government. That's part of its program. It believes in armed revolution, violent revolution. It's not banned. We have a long history of First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States. It's a complex history. it's actually in some respects, not all respects, but in some respects, it's an interesting history. And the final conclusion of our Supreme Court after this long history, beginning pretty much at the beginning of the 20th century, was that unless speech presents an imminent danger of violence, illegal violence, imminent illegal violence, it shouldn't be banned. So we allow for the Communist Party to preach the violent overthrow of the government. And we allow for all sorts of other things. Remember, in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan is a legal organization. And as far as hate speech, I don't know what hate speech is. You know, some people say, if you say transgender people shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sports, that's hate speech. It's an argument. They say that's hate speech. I don't think that's hate speech. I think that's a legitimate disagreement on the question. So I don't think hate speech should be grounds for banning speech, because hate speech is a very subjective thing. I don't think it can be legally or even morally defined in a fashion that would justify its being prohibited. So I don't accept those prohibitions either. If you don't like the hate speech, just turn it off. People say the nastiest things about me. If it comes in the form of an email, I delete it. If it comes in the form of a public remark, I do my best to ignore it. One of the reasons I never use the social media is because I don't want to get distracted by that sort of stuff. So I just bury my head in the ground and do as God's most wisest creation does, namely what's the animal that buries it, that supposedly buries its head in the ground? The
Ostrich.
The ostrich?
I know it actually doesn't, but just bury your head in the ground, ignore everything to the front, in front of you, everything in back of you, everything to the left of you, and everything to the right of you, and just do your work.
You know,
That's a wise strategy.
I'd love to sort of add to that and maybe even ask a question, because I think that you know, the regulation of hate speech is also you know, it's got that sparkle. Like it's easy for us to focus on the regulation of hate speech. And part of what having learned a very little bit about the history of public health, particularly in the US, but with a global perspective in mind, is that, you know, so much of what we have in place legalistically has much more to do. Let's say if you take the case of mental health, you know, we have the right not to be treated really more than we have any sort of, you know, established sort of positive rights or thinking in terms of what is the positive access that we want people to have. And in a similar vein, having seen, you know, periods in at least, you know, United States history where we had relatively robust attempts at public education, part of what seems so concerning to me now is really, as you know, as public spaces are increasingly managed by private companies, you know, that we really have so much loss in terms of actual what we would imagine to be public forums or spaces for the public to actually interact with one another. So I'm so curious, you know, what your thoughts might be in that regard, because I just think, you know, it's always easier to deal with the devil than to than for us, you know, to really be grasping with how do we actually deal with not just the deep lack of education and the huge variety in terms of the way people are educated, but also that it seems increasingly we do need, just to understand daily problems, we need far more knowledge than we used to. So how do we, you know, I'm curious to hear thoughts from the others about sort of how we address you know, the rest of the picture from hate speech.
Well, I was going to add that the banning, or the reason I brought up banning the hate speech or violence is because Facebook is a private company, right? Like, this is the excuse that they use is, well, these are their rules, so you have to play by the rules. But they don't even play by their own rules. I mean, they'll ban things and they won't give you the chance to report it, even like that they're making, even if, let's say it's algorithmic. If it's algorithmic, you should always have the chance to report, like, oh, this is actually a mistake. But sometimes they don't give you the chance, and sometimes you do and they still ban you. So even according to their own rules, they're not playing the game right? But the question that you asked is very important as well, in terms of, well, this is kind of a restriction of the, of the common area of where we can actually discuss things, right? Because we don't have common areas anymore for being able to say our mind. It's all owned by private corporations. So what happened to free speech? So I think that's another question. But the reason I brought up the specific, because those are the two reasons they gave me last in terms of why they banned me, was hate speech for sharing a meme that was from, it was actually a quote from an Israeli minister that was against Palestinians, right? So he said something about Palestinians being like insects or like bugs, right? And then they put that as me saying hate speech, and I couldn't even dispute it. And then the second time was I copied something from the second Hamas charter to discuss it. It's kind of an academic discussion around, okay, this is what they actually say about how they feel about Jews and anti-Semitism. And then that got reported as hate speech or supporting terrorist groups. So Hamas is an official representative of the Palestinian people. And you can't even you can't even bring up their name without them saying that you're supporting a terrorist group, even if you're not necessarily supporting it, you're just, sharing information. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, Amelia, I think what's implicit in what you're talking about maybe should be said explicitly. On the one hand, you have Palestinians sort of fighting with clever tricks and algorithms, all this censorship. But on the other hand, there's another kind of, let's call it cancellation, right? That has nothing to do with algorithms, where we're all just in our own little siloed worlds anyways. And I would never get, Mr. Al-Matti's stream on my Facebook, because Facebook has decided that doesn't make me buy more shoes or whatever they're selling. I don't know, so there's sort of two layers to it. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit more also about some algorithmic issues. I just put this in because it's funny. It says Zehirot Borot Misakanim, which means cautious, dangerous whole, but it was algorithmically translated, as you can see, to caution, dangerous ignorance. And I think the bottom says like Hadar. Well, Mr. Al-Matti probably has better pronunciation, but I think the bottom Arabic is kind of more okay. Is it?
No, the bottom one says the same as the English.
Okay, not
Yeah.
okay.
No.
Isn't Hadar caution?
Yeah, caution. Jahil is ignorance, so dangerous ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah. So this sort of brings me to the role of natural language processing in this mess. Jerome Pacenti is the head of Facebook AI, and he made some interesting tweets about GPT-3, probably because they're not using that model, but it's one of these big, large language models. And I think people need to know it's not the only one like that. It's not the only algorithm like that. I mean, people can use BERT as like one of these huge, large language models. But when you fed this yet to be unleashed on the public algorithm, which came from Google, some prompts, for natural language generation, it generated some interesting stuff. So when you fed it Jews, it said, it said Jews don't read Mein Kampf, they write it, and some other things like that. And when he fed it Holocaust, it said things like most European countries used to be approximately 90% Jewish, perhaps they've recovered. Of course, Jewish people aren't the only people suffering from this algorithmic nonsense. I happen to find a lot of examples where different companies had translated Palestinian. This is from a Turkish YouTube group. They translated it into terrorist, like literally. They just took the word Palestinian, and they, you know, it's algorithmic. So this has these real world implications, right? And this is a headline from Haaretz a few years ago when, you know, a Palestinian wrote good morning into Facebook, and the police came and dragged him away because the translation, according to them, or it does seem to be really what happened, the translation of what he wrote became attack them. So, you know, right now, I'm sort of making fun of these translations, but there's this real problem with the IDF and AI, in my opinion, and maybe other people will disagree, but you know, they're using facial recognition at checkpoints. In this last couple of months, they basically put live a bunch of algorithms. I put some of the names up: Alchemist, Gospel, Depth of Wisdom, and these algorithms, some of them work like recommendation systems. So they're taking all this data from Gaza and having it recommend sort of who might be a terrorist and this kind of thing. So my problem with this is there's like no real indication that Israel is actually ahead of these silly commercial world algorithms or multi-state alliances. Now, I've worked with medical AI quite a bit, and in that role, I've had some peripheral involvement in military work. Actually, not the Israeli Defense Forces, but there are multi-state military alliances and trainings, and the military is absolutely, you know, many countries are absolutely enthusiastic and investing millions of dollars in getting AI algorithms. And, you know, I can think of this one case I was peripherally involved in, where they, you know, wanted to bring exoskeletons and robots and AI algorithms, a bunch of AI algorithms, and even algorithms that were going to monitor the soldiers internally and all of this stuff. And, you know, important people showed up for this, you know, big trial, and in the end, it was absurd. Like, I mean, literally, one of the exoskeletons fell off. None of the algorithms work. I mean, it was just not, these technologies were not ready. So in this state where commercial companies can't even get algorithms right, I want to ask you guys what you feel about, you know, whether we're ready for an AI war. And if you don't have to look at that technologically, because there's the other side, right? Like, are we ready ethically? Are we ready in other ways, politically? Dr. Buttress, what do you think? Are we ready for an AI war?
Well, you know, as a media studies enthusiast, I guess the first thing that pops into my head is just the definition itself. So, you know, I think of how many other versions of sort of AI have we already had in place. And in this case, where, you know, there's a promise that's being presented of, you know, how AI can be used to increase power and to, you know, to have better specificity. You know, I mean, they're always these technologies have been sold usually in the beginning as being progressive, right? And with humanitarian aims in mind, that kind of stuff. So I think the first question, again, kind of goes back to some of the things we were already speaking about, which is, you know, who is it that's going to be benefiting, and sort of, in a sense, who's the scientist and who is the mouse in the experiment? Because once again, you know, this is stuff that's being, you know, the relationships between the algorithms that are oftentimes being cultivated in the private sector for very specific advertising and or, you know, other sorts of intentions, do cross the line to other uses, and we don't know what's been built into them in the first place, but we know it's certainly not, you know, to these humanitarian aims that are always the first thing presented.
Dr. Finkelstein?
Well, first of all, I'm not ready for any wars. So whether they're AI or not AI,
Right.
I'm not prepared for any wars, and anybody who is, in my opinion, a certifiable maniac. And let them go off and fight their wars. I'll even put forth a legislative proposal that an island be isolated for these maniacs. And so far as I'm concerned, because I'm not a Christian, if they all end up killing each other, that's just well and good as far as I'm concerned. Second of all, I am a former Maoist, and one of the things that Chairman Mao, as we used to call him, famously said was no investigation, no right to speak, which is just his way of saying, if you don't know what the F you're talking about, then shut the F up. And I don't know anything about AI. I haven't a clue what it is. All I know is I prefer real intelligence to artificial intelligence. So even when I get emails with suggested responses like, thanks, you're welcome, I will never, ever, ever use a suggested response, even though I will use the same response. I'll say thanks, but I will write it out. I don't want any instrument to appropriate my capacity to or my acting on my own thinking process. I'm very old-fashioned, as you can see. I would only say, speaking strictly as a layperson, because I have many good friends who are involved in AI, and they would take a gun to my head justifiably if I start speaking on this subject. So with all due regard to Yarden cats and many others, I'll just go ahead and say, I think these terms are sometimes thrown around with a certain amount of promiscuity by people who haven't a clue what they're talking about. They don't know what an algorithm is. They don't know what AI is, but they use these terms in a very capricious, promiscuous way. There was nothing about the last Israeli murderous assault in Gaza that had anything whatsoever to do with AI. Anyone who calls it the first AI war is a complete imbecile, moron, idiot, of which there are a large number, unfortunately. Hamas was firing primitive projectiles closer to fireworks than they were to a rocket or a missile. They caused next to no damage in Israel, even during the first days when it was acknowledged by Israel that Iron Dome wasn't working. Initially, Israel said that Iron Dome had malfunctioned. Then they said that Iron Dome wasn't able to deflect a dense barrage of so-called rockets. But if you look at the first day, Israel said Hamas fired 400 rockets. The second day, they said Israel fired 300 rockets. So if Iron Dome weren't functioning, you would imagine that these rockets had caused a huge amount of infrastructure damage. But if you look at the actual reporting by Israel, official Israeli reporting, caused next to no infrastructure damage. A vehicle here, a hole in the apartment there, that was it. It's because these are not rockets, they're fireworks. So what AI has to do with Hamas's arsenal, only God knows. There's probably more danger presented in the United States. I happen to live near Coney Island Beach. There's probably more danger posed to civilians on July 4th, our Independence Day, where there's a substantial fireworks display at Coney Island than there ever has been over the state of Israel by Hamas's supposed rockets. As for Israel, I think it's Iron Dome, judging from past cases, which I've examined closely. It's been wildly inflated. As to what happened in this last exercise, I can't really say because there isn't any the data available independent of what Israel itself says. So Israel says, it's always said, it said since 2012 during Operation Pillar of Defense, it's claimed that Iron Dome has been 90% effective. Experts like Professor Postal at MIT put its efficacy at probably closer to 30% or less. So I don't see where IA enters into all of this. You know, Israel has a very sophisticated, technologically sophisticated weapons arsenal, but I'm not sure whether AI, whatever that is, plays a significant part in it.
Right. I think that when the IDF exercises its speech and claims, you know, these are AI algorithms, what they're talking about is machine learning algorithms that sift through a lot of data. Now, actually, you know, as someone who's worked in this field quite a bit, I can tell you people amongst themselves who work in the field argue a lot about the true meaning of artificial intelligence. And a computer scientist will tell you something very different than you know, someone like myself who works more in data science and machine learning, and you know, how tying it into medicine, which is very practical. I do agree there's a lot of sort of marketing bluster, and I'm actually quite concerned because it seems to be working. I mean, and you know, to bring a little conspiracy theory in here, I wonder if they are then going to, you know, essentially sell these battle tested AI algorithms to who knows. So I see you nodding, Mr. Al-Matti. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've actually worked in the space a bit in the past, and I can say that there's a lot of exaggeration that goes on in this field in terms of the capabilities of these systems. And in terms of just what happened recently, I saw that article from the J Post about, you know, this AI war and everything, and there's a lot of exaggeration. I mean, you can just tell just from the numbers that they cite as well. They said, oh, they killed 150, you know, militants or whatnot using this system, and that would be every male or every man that died during, you know, the bombing campaign that was going on is basically their, you know, their labeling as a fighter, right? Because there was like 65 kids and like 50 women or something like that. So basically they're labeling every man as a combatant. But in terms of they've tested these systems in a lot of places, like you were saying earlier. There's been commercial testing. I mean, they've tried it in the retail space. They've tried it at the borders. They try, you know, here in the U.S. in U.S. military you know, operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Right now, the technology isn't there for what they say they can do, but the fear is that it will get there, and it may and it can get there, right? Because these technologies, they're exponential. They're not just linear growth. They improve rapidly because of the machine learning that's involved in them. So that is the real concern, I think. I mean, especially once you start to get to the intersection of surveillance, the surveillance economy that we live in globally, and the intersection of these corporations that are using, like we were just talking about social media a little while ago, using the social media, using all this data that they already have, the geographical data, and then combining that with other information, with the other data that they have, and then using that just to automate killing, right? Like that's their ultimate plan in the future, is to automate killing, so that a drone can come and just kill somebody randomly, and then they can claim that that was a combatant. There's no way to prove it, right? Or they won't give the proof. Maybe from the other side we could prove it, but if they're not giving us the space to actually say what's going on, because they're banning us and they're shadow banning the posts, then nobody knows if the person they killed was even a combatant or not, and that's already happening. But currently, based on the technologies that they're using, they don't have the capabilities to do what they're claiming. Like facial recognition in the real world is less than 60% accurate. I'm sure one of the things that they're using, that they didn't mention that in the data, but they've used it here in the US as well, is this technology for locating gunfire, like shot spotter or something. If they use that, you know, to pinpoint where the rockets are coming at, that's also, I mean, it has a certain amount of accuracy, but it's not 100% accurate either. But the problem is the automation and the interconnection between all these different systems. And that's happening. And like you said, what they're doing now is they're going around the world and they're saying, we have this system, it worked, and they're trying to sell it and make money off of it. And I think that's their real goal in terms of marketing what they're working on.
Yeah, I agree that the technology is not actually there, but at the same time, that doesn't mean they won't try to use these broken technologies. And I know we have like certain systems here, like Hardope. It's essentially it's a small drone that goes and it blows up, and it's already unmanned. So if you think about it, that's like one code patch away, right? From plugging in some kind of facial recognition that you claim works,
Right.
and then saying it's a specific targeted killing machine. And we've seen actually that like these things don't do as well in the real world, essentially because of a lot of technical problems like out of domain data. I mean, say you have mugshots of all of these people. Well, that is not the same as pictures at night with stuff in the air. It's what I would call, as someone who works in this field, out of domain data. And yet we've seen people deploy these systems. So I'm going to skip the next question because I don't think we'll have time. But the thing is that, like the US and Israel argue that there could be some kind of AI warfare that would minimize deaths, right? Because it would be so specific. And I'm wondering if any of you actually imagine that to be the case, like, or what you think about that and how you actually imagine this.
The whole premise is absolutely ridiculous, because the premise is that the people are dying because the technology is not sophisticated enough. If Israel kills people in Gaza in large numbers, or destroys civilians' infrastructure in large numbers, it's because that was the intention. It's not because the technology was inaccurate or they accidentally caused disproportionate damage. The whole purpose of these periodic massacres in Gaza, from Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 9, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Cast Lead in 2014, the Great March of Return. The whole purpose is to kill people and destroy infrastructure because you want to inflict enough civilian damage that Hamas won't attempt again to retaliate for Israel's murderous activities. That's their goal. The issue is not the quote unquote ineptitude of the technology. If they didn't want to destroy high-rise buildings, they wouldn't destroy high-rise buildings. That's not a problem for them. In Operation Protective Edge, at the end, the last week of August, it was already the ceasefire had been agreed upon, and now there were negotiations on its implementation. And always in the last phase of an Israeli attack, they want to get as much leverage as they can during the last phase of negotiations. So in Operation Protective Edge in 2014, they targeted what were called 4 landmark high-rise buildings, because the landmark buildings are occupied by the Gaza middle class. And so they wanted to exert pressure on Hamas. So they flattened 4 buildings, it looked like a computer game. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't because of inadequate or imprecise technology. That's the goal. The goal is they have a twofold goal. Yes, there is a military goal. They want to, in the last attack, they wanted to kill Hamas senior leaders. Actually, despite all the sophisticated technology, they couldn't get one of them, which is, I think, quite revealing. But also, there's a second goal. There's a civilian goal. The goal is to kill enough Palestinian civilians, Gaza civilians, destroy enough infrastructure so that Hamas won't do it again. So, for example, 2014 Operation Cast Lead, Operation Protective Edge, it was just an apocalypse what Israel visited on Gaza. And it's true, once the soot had cleared and the people of Gaza saw what was visited on them by the Israeli murderous assault, it is true that Hamas lost a lot of popular support in 2014 when the people saw what Israel had done. It killed 550 children. It destroyed 18,000 homes, civilian homes, 18,000. And so, yes, after that, from 2014 to the Great March of Return, it was a pretty quiet border. It's true, it was. From 2014 to 2018, it was a pretty quiet border. Then there was the nonviolent civil resistance by the people of Gaza. And what did Israel do? Well, we know exactly what it did. We have some excellent human rights reports. It targeted, let's underline that word for viewers. It targeted children. It targeted medics. It targeted journalists. And it targeted disabled people. It targeted people who were far, far away from the fence separating Israel from Gaza. Now, let's be clear. It targeted them, and it was because of the sophistication of its weapons, not because they were primitive, but because of the high level of sophistication that they were able to target below, at the kneecap and below of children, to give them life-disabling injuries. It wasn't because of a lack of sophistication of the weapon. It was because of the sophistication of the weapon that surgeons were noting the high number of high caliber injuries to kneecaps and below, so the life of a Palestinian child will be destroyed forever, so long as he or she is still a sentient being. And that was hoped it would serve as deterrent. And as you can imagine, I assume some of you here are parents. So when you hear that the protesters, the non-violent protesters, are incurring life-disabling injuries, you are going to discourage your child from going to the demonstration. That was the whole point. So the very premise of the question is ridiculous because it presumes that Israel doesn't want to kill civilians and doesn't want to destroy civilian infrastructure when that's exactly what it wants to do. That's its goal. That's its objective. That's its purpose. And anyone who says otherwise is a complete imbecile who hasn't read a single human rights report to possibly believe that.
Okay. There are many people in Israel who would argue otherwise. I'm not an expert in the military. I want to switch up, even though we're running out of time, to discuss something I think is really relevant with all of you coming from the US. So I have a picture on the screen from, I guess it was, I don't know, about 5 or 6 days ago. There was this alternate Jerusalem Day March, which is this sort of annual march of really right-wing people who wave flags in Jerusalem. They go through all the sort of areas, including the, I guess, captured areas, waving these Israeli flags. And what hit social media was this point where a bunch of them started screaming death to the Arabs. I saw that on social media, but picking very carefully through stuff, I saw something that I find much scarier. There was a woman who went up to these guys waving these flags and just stood beside them and started waving a Palestinian flag. And the police came, confiscated the flag, and literally knocked her down into the pavement. So with that as a pretext, you know, right now the local police forces in both places are increasingly interested in using AI and robots. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Buttress?
Well, you know, to draw some parallels, I currently live in Baltimore, and you know, now it's been 5 years ago that we had that we had the uprisings in Baltimore following the death of Freddie Gray. That, you know, that really we saw one, you know, the calling in of the National Guard, which was brought in, you know, to police the areas of East and West Baltimore where people were out on the streets. And, you know, I think the visible militarization that people are seeing in cities from Ferguson to Baltimore to Minneapolis has been in some ways probably surprising to people in the United States who have managed to have some sort of strange distinction between military and police. I think what is clear, and again, I'm not a scholar, but I having worked with people who have studied, you know, the history of policing and in particular its impacts on public health. You know, what we're seeing is increasingly already just sort of an expansion of a very militarized police force with that does not live in the same places as the places that it's policing. And the deployment of, you know, new AI and robots, you know, is again happening more and more in areas where police themselves feel it's unsafe to deploy. So you can only imagine, I mean, it's just an expansion of implications that are already really problematic, given the fact that we have, again, you know, the Department of Justice, human rights groups that have documented the violations that have occurred by the, you know, the Baltimore police force and other forces across the US. So again, it's hard to see anything but an extension and expansion of some of what Dr. Finkelstein was talking about, which is that, you know, the violence is happening where people want it to be happening, and with both immediate and political sort of implications.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and it's quite a confusing one in the sense that, if I understand you correctly, you're noting that you're already having policing from people sort of outside the community, and then going to AI puts it even further outside the community. You just take humans out of the loop completely. And I think there might be, if we had better AI, some argument to be made that, well, you know, we had biased people policing already. Maybe this could be better. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Mr. Al-Matti?
So first of all, I agree with what Dr. Finkelstein said earlier about them not really caring. I think the real issue, and I'm going to kind of integrate the two questions together because I think they're connected, is they're trying to create a level of separation between us and them, between those in power and those who don't have power. And they use the technology and the AI to say, actually, it's not us, it's the technology. You know, we're not doing this. There's nobody to blame. The technology is blameless. We created these great algorithms. They work perfectly. You know, this is what they're going to claim, and they're just going after the bad guys. But the real objective of this, whether it's in you know, Palestine or here, is to control people, right? It's not to reduce deaths. It's to control people so that they can't protest, they can't do anything, they can't go outside. They know who you are, they know where you're going. They, you know, like in 2018, people were just protesting. They weren't shooting, they weren't launching rockets. They were going to the, you know, to the fence, and they're shooting them, right? Same thing here. You know, when the Black Lives Matter protests last year, they were attacking people just for protesting. You know, you go out and they attack you. So what they want to do is they want to say, you don't have the right to protest anymore. And they want to use the technologies to be able to identify anybody protesting, to be able to target anybody protesting, to be able to allow those in power and the police and the military to do whatever they want without having anybody to blame. And what they're trying to move towards is, yeah, using robots and AI 100%, so that they don't even have to have it. Well, other than the blame as well is somebody from their side getting injured or hurt, right? So they are basically invincible, and everybody then becomes scared to do anything. And then we live in a you know, total society of control. Because the issue is that it's not just these like inflammations of violence, right? It's like an ongoing continuous violence when you have a state of apartheid in Palestine, where people they're living, you know, under a system where they're not living like, you know, human beings. They don't have the rights to do anything, and they're just putting more and more and more control and limitations on their ability to live, so that then they just give up and they leave, right? That's what they want, is that they want them to leave, or they want them to just like be like basically slave labor to do stuff for them, whatever they want at a low cost. But you know, you can't fight back, you can't do anything, you're just you know, just slaves. Or same thing in the US though. They don't want us to fight back. They don't want us to be able to fight for, you know, labor rights or Medicare for all or any type of rights at all. They just say, okay, you know, you just go to work and you shut up. That's it. And that's their objective.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned work, actually, because that's something I wanted to talk about, and I'll just skip to that actually. And I know we're running out of time, but maybe we'll go back for another thing. You do see a lot of rank and file tech workers, like there's an organization called Jewish Diaspora in Tech. There's Apple Muslim Association. There's a group of tech workers at Amazon who are calling for examining what's going on with the IDF. The workers at Amazon essentially called for a termination of all the contract with the IDF. Is this a positive development? Like, do rank and file programmer tech workers matter, or does it really in the end not matter? What's your opinion, Dr. Finkelstein?
Well, any form of activism is a good thing. Any form of public accountability is a good thing. And I certainly was gratified to see when there were demands being made from inside of these social media to demand that the companies not participate in activities which which are illegal under international law, aiding and abetting abusers of human rights. If you look at the current report by Human Rights Watch, a threshold crossed, which describes Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories as a form of apartheid, and describes Israel as a state based on Jewish domination. It has many recommendations to companies about not participating in activities which abet, in the case of Israel, abet crimes against humanity. So that's always a welcome development. I would say in general, it's no question in my mind, as Atieh said, even if the technology is more bluster than real now, somewhere down the pike, it's going to become real, it's going to become effective, and it's going to become, it already is, but it'll become an even bigger problem. And so I think Number one, we need smart people in tech who can figure out how to combat these sorts of things. So I'm all for young people like Mr. Atieh to go into tech, master the field, and figure out ways to counteract it, even if it's on the social media and not in the real world, so to speak. I'm all for that. That's a good thing. I think for everybody else, it requires a certain amount of courage. Now, it's very easy to speak about courage here because you can be surveilled here and you can be accused of many things here, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up in jail. So I don't want to trivialize when I say courage, because in other countries, for doing exactly the same things as I'm doing now, I'd end up in jail. And I don't end up in jail now. So I try to go the furthest I can without doing something that's going to be very costly to my life. So we have to show a certain amount of courage. It's easy to become paranoid, very easy to become paranoid. Once that paranoia enters into your head, you end up not wanting to write anything on the computer, not wanting to say anything on the phone, because you're being followed, you're being listened to, you're being surveilled. And I reached a point, I didn't reach a point, I was always at the point. I don't want to live a life like that. I don't want to live a paranoid life. I'm going to say what I feel. I'll take the chances. Doesn't mean I'll say everything I feel, but I go pretty far because I don't want to live a paranoid existence. So it requires a certain amount of courage, though courage, as I want to emphasize, is a very different thing in the United States than it is courage in places where they don't have certain restraints in place on government invasion or intervention in your life. So a certain amount of courage, and frankly, I think a certain amount of, I know this is it's so blasphemous to say, a certain amount of lesser dependence on technology. I never owned a cell phone. I never owned an iPhone. I never owned a mobile device. I'm perfectly happy that way. So I figure when everyone else is being targeted by drones, I'll be the only one not targeted because I'm not carrying around a cell phone. So I don't think there's a great harm in, to some extent, diminishing our dependence on or addiction to technology. Maybe shutting down your Twitter feed for an hour and actually reading a page in a book. I don't think that would be the worst thing that can happen in a person's life. And judging from my student papers, it would certainly, hopefully, improve the quality of the papers. So reading student papers don't feel like something worse than Auschwitz, which it usually is nowadays. It's probably the most horrible experience I can imagine, short of a root canal without Novocaine. Reading student papers, they're completely illiterate because of the technology. Nobody reads books anymore. I don't even assign books. I just read together with the class. It's absolutely hopeless. It's a tragedy what happened. A generation has become nearly completely illiterate because of the technology.
Yeah.
So, my agenda is, number one, if you consider yourself a person of the left, you should be fighting all censorship, all rules that are prohibiting speech, away with all the political correctness, away with all the cancel culture. We should be fighting to expand freedom of speech and not enabling people like Mark Zuckerberg or Mr. Dorsey on Twitter to decide what we should be allowed to hear. We should broaden the boundaries of free speech, fight all and any censorship, and in addition, my own particular opinion is we should diminish, not increase, our dependence on technology. because yes, there are many upsides to the web. I would be the last one to deny it, but it's become a serious, if I can intrude in the space of your other speaker, it's become a serious, serious mental health illness. What's happened with the web? It's a very serious mental health illness. The two most serious mental health illnesses of our time are antidepressants and the web. Disaster.
That's an interesting take. I want to go back to something you said actually about fighting for more and more free speech because you know, I wonder sometimes if that's good. Just let everyone speak and do whatever they want. And actually, although I let Sheked boast about, you know, how the Facebook is compliant with Israeli state request in censoring people, and I think when she says people, she really means Palestinians or pro-Palestinian activists. We see like settler groups using various technologies, particularly, especially Facebook, to like raise money for settlements. So right now, like literally over the past couple days, I noted there was this group raising money for a settlement on Facebook, and they were able to raise like $500,000 somehow. And today, literally a few hours ago, the IDF came out and said, actually, this settlement is illegal. So is Facebook a place where we should say, okay, it's free speech and they're just delivering the mail, or would you say maybe they're sort of facilitating a war crime?
Well, it's not maybe, they are. Under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the settlements are war crimes. So that's not a debatable issue. It's right there in the Rome Statute. Those are war crimes. So they're guilty of facilitating war crimes. Now, if they're engaged in the actual raising of money to build settlements, then I think they should be arrested because they are participants in, they are engaged in a war crime. So that to me is not really a complicated question. Whether they should in general be allowed to advocate for the settlements, of course they should. Of course they should. They have every right to advocate for building settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. Should they be allowed to raise money to build a settlement? Well, then you're saying, should they be allowed to participate in the war crime? And the answer is no, they should be arrested.
Mr. Al-Matti, where would you, if you could draw the line, if you were in charge?
I think I'd agree with Dr. Finkelstein. I think that the issue is if somebody's doing something illegal, that has its own laws, right? So you don't actually have to, you know, minimize their ability to speak. But the problem then becomes it's not illegal in Israel, right? So these organizations, they're over there, and they're promoting these ideas over here. So perhaps, I mean, it's a difficult question, right? Like,
I don't quite agree with you. It is illegal in Israel. Israel builds settlements. That's illegal under international law. It's a war crime. And if the ICC investigation of Israel proceeds, there's right now an investigation, Israel it's quite likely, not certain, and maybe not even probable, but there's a good possibility it'll be convicted of a war crime. So whether it's being done there or here, it is illegal under international law, and they should be prosecuted. And those who are raising funds for that, it's no different than raising funds to assassinate a person. You can't go around saying, I want to assassinate X leader. Can you please give me $10? You can't do that. You can't donate money for an assassination. Well, under international law, at least as defined by the Rome Statute of the ICC, it's a war crime, and you're participating in a war crime. So it is illegal in Israel. It's illegal everywhere. That's what makes it international law.
I get that, but I think the issue is actually prosecuting them and actually having that work, right? Like if Israel's basically, they've this, you know, since 1948 till now, they've been above the law. And hopefully, you know, what you're saying happens, and you know, I hope that happens. But if it doesn't, then in the real world, it's not illegal for them. It's, I mean, it's illegal legally, but nobody's getting, there's no accountability. So that's kind of the issue to me.
And you know, since we're all here, I'd love to actually maybe pose it as a question. But back to, you know, Dr. Finkelstein made the comment about the, you know, the internet being one of our greatest mental illnesses of the time. And one of the things that occurs to me in perhaps parallel to that, particularly working in the field of public health, is that there is an absolute lack of imagination in thinking that the internet could be a public good, right? So if we look across the board, Wikipedia is the only of the top 50, you know, sort of platforms that is in fact a nonprofit even. And if you think about the technology of Wikipedia, it's very simple, right? It's literally just group interface texting. And I don't mean to minimize what Wikipedia has done in terms of the complexity, but I wonder and would love to also hear from the others about this. You know, we have zero training at the intersection of sort of political economy, public health, ecological approaches to health, and design in the world of programming, you know, thinking in terms of what kinds of platforms, and which again, I think, you know, internet, we tend to think in very flashy, big, what comes next terms, but oftentimes we really need very simple technologies to allow us to actually be able to stay connected in any regard. Anyways, I'd be curious to hear what others have to say in that regard of thinking about, you know, some potential, even if it's in looking at the hopelessness of the current situation.
Unfortunately, I have to leave now because I have an appointment at 1:30 and I have to get started. So I'm going to sign off. It was nice meeting all of you. And let's hope for the best.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Finkelstein.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wah, wah.
So
So yes.
so your question, your point about making it public good, I think it's a great point. I think it's important. I think the problem is the way that our, you know, our economic system is set up, and the political economy of that as well is what you know, blocks things from that, like that, from happening. Becoming a mainstream platform is extremely capital intensive, and you know, requires a lot of marketing dollars to be able to reach people. And if there's no profit in it for the private sector, you know, right now, nobody's going to put money into it. So there's a lot of platforms out there right now that are distributed, they're free, they're open source, and they barely have any users because no one knows about them, or the user experience isn't that good. So that's an issue, right? And I don't know what the solution to that. I mean, the solution would be, you know, if we actually had a good government or some type of global network that was funding these things. I think that would be more possible. And I mean, it's possible even for us. So I get it. I get frustrated a lot from the way that these systems work, and, you know, getting banned regularly and all of that. And I think we could do much better. And I mean, does it necessarily require government or even big, you know, big investors or anything like that? I don't think so. It just requires all of us deciding to leave together. But that's really difficult. I mean, that's easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Because the network effect is so strong. But I think that if these platforms keep going down the road that they're going and they keep getting worse, maybe that could happen, just because people are getting fed up. At least people in our spaces, right? People are engaged in these things, but that's kind of an issue, is most people they're not necessarily, and you still want to reach them and you still want to be connected with them. So even if we all left, then you'd still have those bubbles to an even greater extent, because you're going to be on a totally different platform. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, there are solutions, but I just don't know how it's gonna come about.
Yeah.
Oh, can I add one last thing?
Sure, sure.
It was actually to the previous point about free speech and these platforms. I was gonna also add that it's better for us to know what's going on, what people are talking about, than for us not to know, because what ends up happening is, if you ban this free speech, when these platforms do it, people go other places, right? They go to more private networks. I mean, we saw that with like the far right, and they went to Parler and all of that. So now we have less of an ability to monitor these people than we had before, and I think that's an issue. I mean, I think it's important for us to know what they're doing, for us to be able to respond to them, and for us to be able to engage with, whether with them or with people who are potentially being affected by that because of these bubbles. And that goes back to the point you made, Dr. Moore, about the actual fact that these networks are creating these bubbles in the first place. So I think that's something that we need to fight against, is we need to push them to kind of take down or taper down the way that these algorithms work, so that they actually if they want to keep being the platform that everybody uses, they need to do it in a way that operates as an actual fair public service, and not just a service that's trying to milk us for every dollar. I mean, yes, they're a private company and they need to make money or whatnot under the current economic system. I get that, but I think that we need to push for laws that protect our free speech, protect our ability to connect with people, and just manage the way that they run these businesses. I mean, Facebook and all these corporations, some of the largest corporations in the world, but there's no regulations on them currently in our system, and there's no push for regulations on them, really. I mean, there's very limited regulations, I guess you could say, and they're basically above the law. I mean, how can a corporation that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars not have any customer support, right? I mean, they have customer support for paying I mean, I guess their customers are these paying corporate people who pay for ads, right? And they have support for them. But how come they don't have support for us as users? Where if we have an issue with the platform, we should have the right to request help from them. I mean, because, like I said, they're banning people for things that you shouldn't be banned for, because you're citing somebody else's quote, right? And when there's no way to connect with them, then that's a real problem, I think. And I think that we should push for regulation, at least at the very least.
Yeah, as a cynic, I would say that I would guess that Facebook does not consider you a customer, rather your eyeballs a product, which it's going to sell to advertisers. And that's really, kind of baked in. In addition to which, I would say, because they want your eyeballs to look at, to gather information and sort of target products, one of their tactics essentially is to grab your attention with inflammatory things. And so I think there is a real danger when we just let all of the free speech go, that it will inflame things. I mean, I live here in Israel, and there was a lot of inter-community violence. I'm not talking about violence against Gaza. I'm talking about violence between Arabs and Jews inside the Green Line. And it was all, maybe not all, but it was incredibly amplified by these social media platforms and technologies, where people could make these little, gang groups on WhatsApp and say, hey, let's go kill some of the other group. And people died. And I just wonder, how much technology was an amplifier. And maybe if we didn't have that instant access to each other through technology, it could have been calmed down. So I do think that sometimes there can be a danger in all of this immediate, instant free speech, although maybe that's the price we're going to pay to learn about the world. I appreciate you guys staying with me for so long. I just have one final question because I know Amelia has to go.
Can I just say something really quick about that last point? Well, if somebody's, you know, actually inciting violence, like let's go kill these people, then that's different, right? That's not even protected free speech. So I think we need to be, you know, clear about what's protected and what isn't, in terms of the, you know, the speech.
Right. So I just want to close up with a question for each of you. Same question. Basically, we just talked about how maybe some of these algorithms further drive conflict, and there's this claim that AI will make war bloodless, but maybe that just means bloodless for the rich and the powerful. Do you have any vision or dream of how algorithms and AI could actually make the region a better place with peace and justice and great things happening? Personally, what, you know, do you have any ideas about that? Amelia, Dr. Buttress?
Well, yeah, I mean, so if they're, you know, again, thinking in ways of how we can cultivate, whether through co-op models or nonprofit, you know, and really any of the platforms, you know, however we get there, I think the biggest challenge again is really that rank and file employees are coming into conflicts with, you know, what they're being asked to do in their day-to-day jobs, and their awareness of what's going on in the world around them, and the sorts of moral and political questions that really come up in people's day-to-day negotiation between what they're being asked to do as workers and what they're being, you know, negotiating as human beings on this planet. So, you know, I think there's nothing but potential, and yet, you know, so long as we're not really building popular movements where the goal is to try to actually find space for everyone and to help people understand the relationship between what they're experiencing in a daily navigational sense and what's going on in the rest of the world, which we all know is interconnected. And yet, you know, it's very, very difficult given these platforms to understand or put ourselves into a social, you know, sort of geopolitical context.
Yeah, if I could just share a note as someone who's actually worked on the engineering side for some medical application AI algorithms, but this would apply across this. I think one thing people don't realize is that when you're on the engineering side, you are often with people who are making what are essentially like moral decisions, and you're making them like immediately, right? You're deciding, well, we will take this many misdiagnoses, or, you know, we're comfortable with this % being wrong. You're making these huge moral decisions when you code these things, and you're not always thinking of it as something you should step back and think about philosophically. So I think that's unfortunate because, you know, as engineers or physicians or other people who write the code on these things, we're not always thinking about these implications. And in the whole commercial structure,
Well,
nobody goes to the top and think, yeah.
And I would add to that, you know, in many settings in public health, because time and because, you know, resources are often so stretched, there really is very, very little interdisciplinary engagement. And I don't just mean that in an academic context, but we really do have problems of the siloing of, you know, the philosophical problems from the scientific ones. If anything, we need far, far, far more active, you know, negotiation between these areas, because I think for many people, again, you know, we talk about AI and the ways in which algorithms, you know, become sort of invisible, but the politics are invisible oftentimes as well. And having, you know, grown up in what sometimes gets described as the neoliberal era, in which, you know, there really was no questioning whether or not the market was going to be sort of the only game in town. And there really was, no political sense that, you know, that there could be an alternative way of organizing social relationships. And, you know, in the past 10 years, we've seen globally, you know, really, but definitely in the United States, you know, a reopening of some of those questions around how do we actually organize. So, you know, it's a very dangerous time and a very chaotic time. And therefore a very important time, you know, for us to do everything we can to be finding each other and getting creative about, you know, what oftentimes, again, I feel like people in their day-to-day work see all kinds of possibilities that they themselves aren't able to have a pathway because of the dynamics of what organizations are being, you know, are driving people to do.
Okay, we have to sort of wrap it up, but Atieh, I believe you're the youngest of us. So that means whatever mistakes are made now in the online world or the real world in the future with AI war, you're going to have the longest to live with them. So I'll give you the last word.
Sure. You know, I agree with Dr. Buttress that we can do a lot more with AI and with technology than we're currently doing. I think the issue is that as long as capitalism is the economic system that we're basing our world on, as long as money is above human life and human well-being, we're going to have these issues. I mean, the reason that the systems work the way they do, the reason they're causing these mental health issues, these wars, is because I mean, a lot of this is because it's money. The systems can work in a way that can actually encourage cooperation and improve the world. And I mean, I can imagine a world where we use AI and technology to basically live in a utopia, right? And we're not going to be able to do that as long as we have the economic system that we do. So I don't see a solution to this problem. I don't see a technological solution to this problem. I see a social and philosophical and economic solution that we have to address, you know, as soon as possible, because if we don't, we're going to destroy the planet and we're going to destroy ourselves. And that's scary to think about. You know, it goes beyond just what's happening in Palestine. And, you know, the climate is we're at the brink of ecological extinction, right? So we have to address all these issues are interconnected and we have to address them, because if we don't, you know, we're going to go extinct.